Welcome to the Wisconsin in Focus podcast, powered by the Center Square. I'm Bruce Walker, Great Lakes Regional Editor of the Center Square Newswire Service. Wisconsin in Focus is a production of America's Talking Network, and you can find all of the Center Square's great podcasts at americastalking.com. That's americastalking.com. And we ask you to subscribe to Wisconsin in Focus wherever you listen to your podcast. We're recording today. It's Thursday, January 19th, 2022. And joining me is Wisconsin correspondent Benjamin Yount. Ben, you're always running here and there. Tell me, it's already the end of January. We're almost 1 month into the new year.
I heard it put today that Thursday is Friday Junior. I really like that.
I like that too.
Friday Junior. That's how I'm going to refer to Fridays or to Thursdays from here on out. But yeah, no, it's 2/3 of the way through the month, and we'll be talking about 2023 in the rearview mirror sooner rather than later. It always happens. This week, by the way, just flew by. I don't know if it was because we were busy or because we was sort of settled in, or there wasn't anything terrible, no huge rainstorms or snowstorms, at least not here in the Midwest. And so I don't know, but yeah, Thursday, the 19th of 2023, those are numbers turned into words that it blows my mind.
Wow. Well, listen, my friend, let's get started on talking about some of the more salient news stories from this week. And I unfortunately was not here last week, but so I kind of missed all the excitement and the hullabaloo. But still a lot of things happening this week. And let's start out with I received a news release today from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and they are represented by the Wisconsin Transparency Project. Have you seen this press release?
This out of Madison for the hey. We asked you for some things about a year ago, and you've ignored us for about a year. So, yeah, what's up with that news release, or one of the many others that Will is fighting the good fight with? Because they just put one out not too long ago. They're now threatening to sue the city of Neenah over some First Amendment violations up there. It's a case of people putting signs up that they don't want their land rezoned. And Neenah, of course, well, you can't do that. You've got to be, everybody's on the team. And come on, don't you want to tear down this wonderful area and build something shiny and new? But no, yes.
Let's go to Dane County.
Will.
Right. Let's go to Dane County. Let's start there. And if you feel so compelled, you may proceed to talk about Neenah.
Well, no, I've never been to Neenah. I hear it's a beautiful place, but I think that we can skip that one. This is quite simply what Will has sort of taken on the role of. That when you take a look at the larger news organizations here in Wisconsin, the State Journal, the big paper in Madison, the Journal Sentinel, the big paper in Milwaukee, and many of the day-to-day TV stations, they just don't do the investigative reporting that they used to. Some of that is change in the media. One of the reasons why the Center Square exists. Some of that is this perceived bias that maybe they don't want to ask some of these tough questions of their local schools. But this is a First Amendment case, an open records case that, between you and me, has some folks in the media quite bothered with as well. Essentially, what happened is there was a curriculum that was distributed in part. Will got a hold of a piece of something talking about small instructional groups. And the note inside the curriculum plan for small instructional groups talked about giving preference to African American students, making sure that students of color were recognized, were focused on, were given more attention. And this obviously raised red flags because discrimination, even if it's discrimination for the right reasons, with a question mark, is still discrimination and is still wrong. So Will did what Will does, and they asked for all of the documentation on this. They filed an open records request, said, hey, this is something that's floating around somewhere. Can we please have all of it? We want to read the full curriculum. We want to know who's saying what to whom. So send us over any emails, any communications. They did that about this time last year, and they've heard nothing. They've gotten nothing. And so now they're going to court to have a judge force the school districts to turn over whatever it is that they have. Now, there are two things. I'll explain the Madison reaction here in just a moment. But Wisconsin's open records law is pretty clear that governments, and that's what school districts are. We tend to forget about that, right? When we think of government, we think of the president, we think of Congress, maybe the governor, maybe the state legislature, mayor, county executive here in Wisconsin. But people tend to forget that schools aren't just there to run high school basketball games and graduations, that they are a arm of the government. They can tax. And so Wisconsin's open record law is clear that these government branches are supposed to comply with open records requests without delay. It's not an immediate thing. I don't know that there is a specific 7-day clock, but it says do it quickly without delay. And a year, Will argues, is a considerable delay. Now, there was a piece in the local Madison television market where the school district said, hey, this really was never a curriculum. The piece talking about focusing on African-American children, that was changed months ago. This really isn't a story. There's no reason to ask any questions. Will is a conservative firm. And it was a very dismissive response to, hey, what's going on? And it again missed the point of what Will is asking for, which is to see just what is being said about teaching all students of all colors in Madison metropolitan schools. And this, by the way, is not the first time that Will and Madison schools have clashed. There has been a healthy, use that word, healthy back and forth between the two. But yeah, this is, and I know that open records stories are not necessarily sexy, but this is the stuff that matters because, again, somebody has to do the job of looking and making sure. There has to be a government watchdog. And as we have fewer and fewer people on this side of the microphone, fewer and fewer people on this side of the keyboard, fewer and fewer people who can spend their time, because doing investigative work is time consuming. It is a skill that other people have far more than I. It is something that we absolutely need. And if the papers in Madison or the TV stations in Madison aren't going to do it, then the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty is, and they're stepping up. And so this stuff does matter. It does matter if teachers or teachers unions or administrators are talking about educating some kids more than others. And to say, I want to know who said what about this is not an unreasonable request. And even if you do buy the entirety of the explanation from Madison schools of, well, we changed it a while ago, and this really was never a formal. Well, let's see the emails that say that. Let's see the paper trail where you push back on the teacher and say, no. We have to teach all students equally. And no, we're going to strike this, and here's the final guidance. That stuff matters. And so Will is once again doing that work because, frankly, nobody else in the state is.
Well, I think you'll find across the nation a lot of free market think tanks have introduced their own legal teams to take on cases such as this. And what is it precisely that Will is looking for from the Madison Metropolitan School District?
They want to know what the policy is.
They want to know what the policy is.
They want to know.
Are they seeking damages?
What was proposed? I don't think that there's so much seeking damages. I mean, I think that this is usually all just pay the legal fees. I think that's the only money here. But this is not a slip and fall at the grocery store. This is not my flight got canceled by Southwest, so I owed $5 million. This really is about transparency. And this is about shining a light on what goes on behind the scenes, because not to jump into the talk radio job that I have, but these are kids, and we trust the people who run our local schools to treat our kids fairly, to treat our kids well. We trust them to actually educate our children. the point of public schools, as I have said for years and years and years, and as I think I stole the line from Joy Pullman years ago, the point of public schools is not to get kids into college. It's not to train the next generation of welders. It's not to make sure Microsoft has coders. The purpose of public schools is to make sure that young men and women, 18 and 19-year-olds, have a base knowledge when they leave school so they can be productive members of society. They need to know how to read and write and do math, but they also need to understand enough about their biology and chemistry. They need to understand civics. They need to understand the world that they're going into so that they can actually contribute to that world. And if we're getting a policy that says, well, I mean, those kids need less help because those kids, well, nobody wants to see their kid in the group of those kids. So the goal here is not so much to punish Madison schools, drop an imposing fine on them. The point here is transparency. And Tom Kamenik, who is the leader and founder of the Wisconsin Transparency Project, threw in the statement in the announcement of the lawsuit. He said, Madison Metropolitan Schools may be the worst offender in the state when it comes to extreme delays in responding to records requests. Several requests to the district remain unfulfilled more than a year later, and they have a long history of problems. You have in Madison in general, and in Madison schools in particular, almost a mindset of go home, shut up, pay your taxes, don't ask any questions. These are our schools. These are our kids. We will do with them what we want. And these snapshots, which is a term that I love to use, these snapshots of just what's going on in schools have done more to anger parents, to get parents involved, done more to push support for school choice in Wisconsin than anything in recent memory. This goes back to when parents got a look during the learn from home days of the coronavirus. Parents saw what their kids were learning, many times more to the point, what their kids weren't learning, and parents became upset. And you saw this not just in Madison, not just in schools across Wisconsin, because you certainly did, but in schools across the country, the so-called mommy revolution of parents going down and saying, hey, wait, whoa, what's going on here? What are we teaching? Why aren't these kids learning the basics? Why aren't these kids learning the same thing that we learned when we were in school? And Madison, and this is part of the point of this lawsuit, Madison simply refuses to share information that it has, information that belongs to the public, but is theirs. They feel that they don't need to share it. And that's why these kinds of lawsuits are necessary. That's why these kinds of lawsuits are important, because this is, to quote the J.G. Wentworth commercial badly, they say it's our money and I want it now. This is our information. This is our government. These are our schools.
These are our children.
And we deserve to know what's going on inside. And the response from Madison schools of just simply saying, well, we'll get to you later, or we'll get to you never, is unacceptable.
Okay, well, one more point before we close out on this topic. According to the news release, while the lawsuit is about records, the underlying issue is even more troubling. And they go back to something I read quite some time ago, that the 3 R's in education, reading, writing, arithmetic, has now been transformed into race, and race. And so we have a quote from Corey Brewer, who is the associate counsel at Will, who said, race discrimination has no place in public education. It is illegal and immoral. Parents and community members have a right to know how and why Madison has been discriminating against students based on race.
I was not old enough, but I went to school.
Are you
long enough ago.
Shaming me again?
Yes, no. I do not remember Brown versus Board of Education firsthand.
Okay.
There was never there was never legal segregation in any of the schools that I went to. My mother is of that generation, and she would tell stories about how the people of her generation, again, she was a hippie, but they fought against the idea of separating people out by race. She was old enough to remember in person when blacks and whites couldn't eat at the same lunch counter, when blacks and whites didn't go to school together, when marrying somebody of a different color was an actual crime. we worked really hard in this country, and this is Martin Luther King Day week. Martin Luther King worked very hard and ultimately gave his life for the idea to treat people equally. That his focus was equality, not equity, and he would be aghast to see that there is now liberal racism and discrimination and segregation being put back into the public lexicon. And this is where you have some people who believe that, well, we're not discriminating. We're making things fair to historically repressed or underrepresented students. And I'm sure if you went back to 1930 bad, you would find someone in Alabama who would say, well, we're not separating out white kids and black kids because we don't want black kids to be in a school with white kids. We're doing it because it's better for the black kids. That was wrong then. This, if they are teaching up students of color while ignoring white or Asian students, is equally bad. And that's why you need to know, that's why we need to know just what the policy was, just what the conversation was. Because most times, and I've done this long enough to know that many times when you look behind the curtain, when you get the final documentation, there's not a lot of pushback to whatever these ideas are. And if race has become the focus in schools, what that means is education is no longer the focus in schools, and that defeats the purpose of having schools.
Okay, well, I think we pretty much exhausted that particular topic for this week at least. And you submitted a story to me about 15 minutes ago. About 40 minutes ago now. And it's on the Assembly bail reform. And I haven't had a chance to read it. So why don't you give me a rundown on that?
Yeah, bail reform has been one of the topics du jour since the legislature came back earlier this month. And last week we got sort of the setup, the committee hearing. And this week we got the votes. Earlier in the week, it was the state Senate that passed this on almost a strictly party line vote. And this goes back in some ways to the Waukesha Christmas Parade massacre, but Republicans have been working to change the way that bail works in Wisconsin since 2017. I remember one of my very first stories written for the Center Square here in Wisconsin was on a hearing about how judges were asking for permission to consider more when setting bail. The Constitution in Wisconsin is clear about two things. One, everybody has to get at least some bail. Could be $20, could be a signature, could be $1 million, but everybody has to get something. And the Constitution currently also only allows judges to consider whether someone's going to come back to court as the condition for bail. If you're going to come back to court, there's no sense in setting $1 million bail according to the Constitution. Doesn't matter what you did. Doesn't matter your criminal history. Doesn't matter if you're likely to cause a new crime, to commit a new crime. If you are likely, if there is anything in your record that shows that you're going to come back to court to answer the charges, well, then they don't want to hold you in the county jail for forever. So they just let you out. Darrell Brooks Jr., who was the driver that killed 6, injured 60 in the Waukesha Christmas Parade, he's one of these guys who had a lengthy criminal record. He was in jail for domestic violence and threatening his ex-girlfriend, but he was released on $1,000 bail, got out, and a couple of days later committed a new crime. He committed domestic violence again, and then he jumped in his car, sped away from police, and ran through that parade crowd, and it became the national story that it is. And people ask the question, why was he not still behind bars? If this is someone who has a criminal record that goes back years and years and years, why was he allowed out? And the explanation is quite simply, there's nothing that judges can consider other than he's going to come back to court. And in Milwaukee, they use that as, I don't want to say a convenient excuse, but Representative Scott Allen from Waukesha said it, so I'll use his words. Judges use that as a convenient excuse to let people out of jail and continue with what he calls their soft on crime policies. So in order to fix this, because Governor Evers has been against the idea of changing how bail works, and because the Constitution limits what judges can consider, Republicans pushed through a constitutional amendment. Now, just a little Civics 101 with your Uncle Ben. Constitutional amendments have to pass in 2 consecutive legislative sessions before it can go. And then it has to pass. It passes in 2 consecutive legislative sessions. Then it goes on the ballot. Then voters have their say. And Republicans pushed this through last year. This was their first order of business here this year. And what it means is that voters will now see this as a question on the April ballot. Do you want to change how bail works? Democrats, whether or not they agree with cash bail or the specifics of this plan, also don't like this idea because they fear that it will help drive conservative voters to the polls. The big election, the reason that everyone is focusing on April of 2023 is that there is a seat for the Wisconsin Supreme Court that is up for grabs. And Democrats are doing their level best to make sure that their voters turn out. Republicans are doing their level best to make sure their voters turn out, because he who decides, or she who decides, the court will decide so many issues going forward here in Wisconsin. And so you have this whole amalgam of things coming together. But as we saw earlier today, every single Republican and a number of Democrats in the assembly voted to give this as a question to the voters. And so voters will ultimately decide if they want to see how bail works in Wisconsin changed. And I don't know that we can say yes or no. I think that it's a pretty popular idea. But again, when you put it into the political context of what is coming in April, we'll have to wait and see.
Well, thank you, Uncle Ben, for explaining that to me. Next week, we should get a musical backtrack for it, and it could be another episode of Schoolhouse Rock with Uncle Ben in the Jack Sheldon role. Because, Jack Sheldon was the band leader on the Merv Griffin Show, but he was also and trumpet player, but he was also the singer for the male vocals on Schoolhouse Rock. Just so you know, he was a friend of Jack
When
Webb's.
I worked at the Illinois Capitol, when I worked at the Illinois Capitol, we would get interns every spring. It was a great program, the public affairs reporting program for anybody at home who wants to get a one-year master's degree. And one of the bureau chiefs would have, as part of sort of the test, he would have candidates watch the "I'm just a bill, I'm only a bill" piece. And it's only a couple of minutes long. And it would tell you, it talks about how a bill becomes law, which is what we do at state capitals. And the question that he would always ask at the end that would always trip up, or mostly trip up, candidates was, what was that bill about? And do you remember what the bill in "I'm Just a Bill" was actually about?
I do not recall. That's a good question. I can tell you it was sung. It was sung by Jack Sheldon, but
yes, no, it's great music. Love it. The legislation was actually about having school buses stop at train tracks to make sure that it's safe to go forward.
Oh, okay.
Go rewatch it now, and you'll notice. You're like, I can't believe I never noticed that. We were all too busy singing along to.
Right. Well, the female singer on a lot of the Schoolhouse Rock was Ezra Mohawk. So now you know that piece of musical trivia. So you can put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Next time we'll talk about No More Kings. And then the time after that, we can talk about Three-Ring Circus, Three-Ring Government.
Right.
See, those were the only ones I watched. That and the preamble. I never really watched all the math ones. Although 3 is a magic number, one of my favorite songs.
And Jack Sheldon
ever.
Singing Naughty Number 9. Come on. That's a classic. But with the pool table, it was fantastic. So, hey, listen, Ben, thanks a lot for being here. I appreciate all of your insights and all of your hard work. Ben is the Center Square's Wisconsin correspondent. Wisconsin in Focus is powered by the Center Square, a production of America's Talking Network. You can find all of the Center Square's great podcast at americastalking.com. That's americastalking.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, we ask you to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Bruce Walker, Great Lakes Regional Editor of the Center Square Newswire Service. Listen for another episode of Wisconsin in Focus next week.